This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Gary Groth. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek, and on this episode, I have the pleasure of talking with Gary Groth. His new book, Sparring with Gil Kane, Debating the History and Aesthetics of Comics, came out earlier this month from Fantagraphics. And I had a great time talking with him about the various interviews and transcriptions that are included in this volume. But before we get to that conversation, I want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the good folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off at the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off of the cover. But every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that. And if you go to Discount Comic Book Service's website right now, you'll find Sparring with Gil Kane at 35% off of the cover price. That's right, you can get it for $14.94. Great discounts now and every month at dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you. Fans of Gil Kane have long known that not only was he quite an accomplished artist and one of the legends in terms of comics history, but he was also a serious and deep thinker, especially when it came to the place of comics and its potential. And that's one of the things that really comes out among all of the 13 different interviews and panel discussion transcripts that are included in Gary Groth's new collection, Sparring with Gil Kane, Debating the History and Aesthetics of Comics. You'll hear over the course of our conversation the long work that went into compiling this collection of interviews, the very personal connection that Gary had with his subject matter, and perhaps most strikingly, the ways in which Gil Kane and Gary Groth were kindred spirits, and how the iconoclastic views of this Silver Age artist really struck a chord with the publisher, who himself is known as a maverick. I had a wonderful time talking with Gary about his new book, and I want to share that conversation with you now. I have the pleasure of talking with Gary Groth. He is a comics editor, critic, and, of course, the publisher of Fantagraphics. Gary, welcome to the Comics Alternative.
Well, thanks for having me.
You have a big fan base with those who work on the Comics Alternative because we discuss so many Fantagraphics books, so it's great to finally have you on the podcast.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, and I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, and what I want to talk with you particularly about today is one Fantagraphics book that came out earlier this month, Sparring with Gil Kane, Debating the History and Aesthetics of Comics. And this is a collection of interviews and transcripts of panel discussions that have included Gil Kane either as, let's say, one of the main participants or one of several, let's say, participants over the, I guess, since what, the 1960s? I think the late 60s is the earliest piece. Is that correct?
That's right. The earliest piece is probably 69, which was his Hal Foster interview that took place at the 1969 New York Comic Art Convention at the Statler Hilton Hotel in Manhattan. And then the last piece, I believe, was 1989 or 1990, so it spans roughly 20 years.
Right, and that was, that last one, The State of the Comics Industry, which included...
That was that was recorded, I believe, in 1971.
Okay.
And I put that at the end of the book because it was sort of an oddball piece. I found it almost by accident when I was editing the book, and it's a roundtable conversation that Gil Kane organized, and it includes Stan Lee and Will Eisner and John Goldwater, who was the publisher of Archie, and a couple of other cartoonists who were working at the time. And it was Gil Kane's attempt to bring together, I don't know, influential or paradigmatic cartoonists of the time to discuss the state of the industry, which, as you might imagine, was really not done by anyone at that time. But Gil was curious enough, and I never spoke to Gil about this, and I didn't even know it existed until I was putting this book together, and I stumbled on it. But that sort of thing was simply not done at the time, when artists would try to assemble a group of people and tape them and then publish them. This was published in the National Cartoon Society newsletter. And I think it was his attempt to try to understand what was happening in the business, both in terms of the business itself and the art. And so I stuck it at the end of the book because it seemed like a good coda. Yeah,
and it does read that way. So this book is a collection of, 13 interviews or discussions, and then there are, I believe, 3 short essay pieces by Gil Kane himself. And, one of the things I took away from reading Sparring with Gil Kane is, I guess, the very personal nature of this project for you. At least that's what it seemed like to me as a reader. I came away feeling that this was something that you felt very close to, and I could see that even from the very beginning in your introduction and then in the pieces that you included here. So I'm wondering when you first began formulating ideas for this book project.
Well, let me first say that I'm gratified that came through because, as you might have noticed, and I don't know how much of this you actually know, but as you might have noticed in my introduction to the book, I actually refrained from talking about my personal relationship with Gil. Mm-hmm. And I did that deliberately because I just wanted to keep it strictly to what his position was, and I didn't feel the need to inject a history of my own friendship with Gil. But this is a project I've been wanting to do for years. It's been in the back of my head for a number of years, and I simply had to carve out the time to do it. It was a pretty time-consuming project because it required a lot of assembling the material and then editing it and then writing all the introductions or getting other people to write the introductions to each piece to give them context. So it was a labor-intensive book, and as you might imagine, it's not a book that's going to be a bestseller. So I had to carve out the time to do it. And it's one of 3 projects involving Gil Kane that I've had in queue for years. I was particularly excited about this book because it's such an unusual book in that I don't think you can name any other artist of his generation who went out of his way to interview his peers, or have discussions or debates with his peers as Gil did, which of course is what made him unique in his generation.
I did notice that in your introduction to the collection, you really don't talk much, if any, about your personal relationship with Kane, although I have to say, I found myself going through this text, reading between the lines, the number of interviews or panel discussions that included him and then you were a part of it in one form or another. So I found that that fed into my response of feeling that this was a very personal project for you. And even though you did refrain from putting your own personal relationship with Kane in the forefront, how did your own experiences with him inform the tone of this collection?
Well, as I was putting it together, of course, I realized that I was involved in or directly responsible for maybe half of the conversations in the book, which surprised me a little bit. Now, ironically, I guess I was first. I saw Gil Kane for the first time when I attended the 1969 New York Convention banquet honoring Hal Foster, and that was probably the first time I saw Gil Kane. It was the only time I saw Hal Foster, and I remember, even at the age of 14, being blown away by the level of conversation which I'd never previously heard. Gil interviewed Foster, and it was an intelligent, sensitive interview about his work, his career, and his art. And I'd never heard anything like that. I'd never heard comics being talked about like that. And it was mostly a room full of adults. I was one of the few minors in the room. So that probably affected me pretty deeply. And then I got to know Gil in the late 1970s. I interviewed him for the Comics Journal. And all my interviews with Gil from the Comics Journal will be in a second book. And I got to know him, and it's not an exaggeration to say that he was probably my closest friend for 20 years, from about 1980 until his death in 2000. We became very close, and we would just see each other a lot. We would see each other once or twice a week because we, through 1990, we lived, within proximity of each other until I moved to Seattle and he moved to Florida. And so during the course of our friendship, we were always talking. We had dinner once or twice a week. I would occasionally go to his place. We would go out a lot, and we were always talking about projects he wanted to do. And one of the things I could do, and that I could, I could actually make work, is to get him to talk to other cartoonists. So I would arrange meetings. I would arrange interviews. I believe the first interview in the book, or the first, it's actually close to a debate, is with Denny O'Neil,
right?
Who was also a friend of mine at the time. And the way that came about is I simply, I talked to Gil about getting him to talk to another creator in the field, and I suggested Denny, and Gil was up for it. And I talked to Denny, and Denny took a train up to Connecticut, and we went over to Gil's place and spent the night there. So a lot of the pieces in the book were sort of generated by me, where I would lure Gil into a conversational opportunity, and he was always game for it.
In fact, what you mentioned regarding the first interview, the one that you set up between Kane and Denny O'Neil, leads me to something that, I sensed in this collection, and I'm wondering if I'm somewhat at least on track. It seemed to me that there was, I guess loosely speaking, a strategy of the way, the kind of interviews and panel discussions that you included in this collection. And I broke them down into three categories. I think the most striking to me, because they're the most interesting, are where you pair Kane with opposites. And by opposites, I don't necessarily mean someone who's of a completely different point of view. And there is a debate, kind of like we see in that first interview with Denny O'Neil. But individuals who come from different perspectives, from even different cultures. So in addition to the piece with O'Neill, I'm thinking of those interviews that include Robert Crumb, maybe Chaikin and Simonson, Messier, and then Phelps to some degree. So that's one category. Another kind of interview that I saw, or panel transcript, is those that paired Gil Kane with another creator in a way that Kane's participation basically highlighted the other person.
That's right.
And so, with Walt Kelly, Bill Everett, those kind of, the older, more legendary creators in that sense. And then a third kind of interview that I saw transpiring is when you included those pieces that placed Kane within the context of the industry. So, for instance, there's one where he's talking with Howard Chaikin and another with you and Harvey Kurtzman. But then the last one that you had mentioned, the state of the comics industry. And it seemed to me that most fell within those categories in some way or another, maybe in a couple of them.
Yeah, I think those categories are roughly accurate. I would only quibble with the suggestion that there's a category where he's paired with opposites, because in something like the conversation with Don Phelps, they are so completely aligned in terms of their understanding and appreciation of comics and how they approach the form. I think you can just feel the kind of synergistic exuberance of the two of them, and it was the first time they'd met, I believe. And they just got along. They shared an appreciation for the same kinds of virtues in comics, and that's one of my favorite pieces, and it's a piece that I'd never seen print before. I put it together. Let me see. I think it was around 1982 when it occurred, and then we transcribed it. And for some reason, I never published it. So this was the perfect opportunity to publish it. And so you can see where they're just so perfectly aligned in their understanding and appreciation of comics as a popular art form full of aesthetic potential. Mm-hmm. Now, with the Denny O'Neill thing, I paired them deliberately because I knew that they would have some opposing points of view. And Gil really enjoyed, enjoying might not be the right word, but he was compelled to assail the status quo, the creative and editorial status quo of comics, which he worked, he was a working cartoonist. And I think he was also an intellectual, and that was very unusual at the time. The cartoonists who were like that, you could probably count on the fingers of one hand. And so I paired them deliberately because, I wanted them to have this opposing point of view, and I wanted them to debate comics, and it worked up to a point. Denny was not as dogmatic as Gil was about defending the status quo as Gil was assaulting it. And in fact, I think there's a funny passage in that where Gil just keeps going on about the editorial restrictions in comics and just how infantile comics are compared to every other forum in America.
Right.
And he just wails on that from every possible angle, and he's not really getting a lot of pushback from Denny. And he has a long kind of soliloquy about this, and Denny gives him a short answer. And Gil, I don't know if you noticed it, but then Gil finally just sort of gives up, and he says something like, "Well, okay, I'm gonna tackle this from an entirely different angle, or I'm going to change the subject or something." So I think that's right. And then, there's that category you mentioned where Gil is literally interviewing other cartoonists, and basically listening rather than discoursing about comics. And I think that, demonstrates his his curiosity about the form and his curiosity about the artists that he admired, people like Hal Foster and Walt Kelly and Bill Everett, as you mentioned.
What you were describing in terms of that experience with Denny O'Neil, that first interview in this collection, leads me to another question, something that I was wondering throughout. As you point out, about half of these interviews you played a part in one form or another. So I'm wondering, is there any one or even more of these pieces that, as you were pulling everything together, really stood out to you as maybe the most challenging of the interviews, or maybe the most problematic, or even one that resulted in the most unexpected results?
I don't remember any of them being difficult or problematic, and partly that's because Gil is such a conversational catalyst that most of the time I could pair him up with somebody and sit back and watch them go. There are a number of particularly gratifying pieces in there. Gil and I flew to Paris together, and that's how we were able to interview Jean-Claude Mézières. Mm-hmm. And as I related in the introduction, I think it was Gil who had met him previously. And that was a great interview because it was so completely different from an American perspective. We were talking to Jean-Claude, who I got back in touch with when I was putting the book together, who's still around and still drawing comics. And I think you can tell from that interview that Gil was intensely curious about what was happening in Europe, and Jean-Claude was able to give his, uniquely European perspective on American comics, and that created a terrific dynamic. But nothing was, I don't remember anything being difficult. Talking to Gil or watching Gil talk to others was incredibly easy. He did all the heavy lifting.
Is there an interview that you can recall that resulted in something that surprised you, something that seemed to come out of nowhere, and you're just glad that you were able to be a part of it and capture it?
That's a damn good question. I'm not sure if I can specifically cite anything. Again, the Phelps interview is one of my favorites, just because they're both so excited about what they're talking about, and it's such a genuine conversation about the aesthetic merits of their favorite stuff. One thing I can tell you, I guess I didn't mention this in the book because it was unfortunate and almost embarrassing, but I organized a conversation among Gil Kane, Will Eisner, and Art Spiegelman. This would have been somewhere around 1982 or 1983, and we all met at Art's apartment in New York, and I taped about 3 hours of conversation. And then I proceeded to misplace or lose the tapes.
Oh, my God.
I know, it's one of the great losses that I lament. And, of course, when I was putting this book together, I searched for them because that would have been great to include in the book, and I still couldn't find them. It's possible they're still residing somewhere in my office, buried somewhere, but I cannot figure out what I could have done with those tapes. But that was a terrific exchange because you had three people, 2 generations, 3 radically different points of view, but all of whom took comics seriously as an art form, all talking about that subject, comics as an art form and what was happening at that time and where comics were going.
You mentioned this tragically lost interview with Eisner. It strikes me that one thing that Kane and Eisner have in common is that, they're both either golden or silver age, primarily depending on, where you emphasize things. Creators who really challenged the medium and in ways that kind of put off a number of people, and especially those within the business end of the industry. And I'm wondering, is that the side of Kane that drew you, maybe even from the very beginning when you were young, to him as a creator, or was it simply his art, or both?
Well, when I was a kid, I loved his art because I grew up reading Green Lantern and the Atom. I was at exactly the right age for that. So, of course, my first admiration for Gil was for his drawing and for his art. But then as I got older and I started, educating myself and learning more about art in general and trying to apply those principles to comics, everything I learned about film or fiction, I started appreciating Gil more for his being, at that time, really the only serious public intellectual in comics who put himself out there and set himself in opposition to the entire aesthetic status quo of comics at that time. That's what I admired, and I think that's why we became so close. Now, his relationship with Will Eisner was always fraught. They did not get along. I think they had a kind of icy, cordial, professionally, outwardly cordial relationship. But I don't think they liked each other. I know that Gil thought that Eisner was pretty much a fraud. And I don't know what Will thought of Gil because I wasn't close to Will, and after I'd written a piece about Will, I was farther away from Will than ever. But I do think that they were, and it wasn't a rivalry. There was some, I think that they neither one liked the other one's stances or public postures. I know that Gil thought that Eisner was a bullshit artist, and I suspect that Will probably thought that Gil was, pretentious and probably didn't follow through on all of his highfalutin theories in his own work, which is a fair criticism. But Gil was the odd man out. I mean, speaking about his relationship with Eisner, he had a not dissimilar relationship to many of his professional peers, and that's another thing that appealed to me about Gil, was that he was willing to be a kind of pariah in the industry. He criticized comics so much that he was off-putting to other people, to other creators in the business, including many of his own peers with whom he clashed. He didn't get along with a lot of people. And then neither did I. So maybe that's another thing that drew us together. Whenever we would go to a convention, we went to a lot of conventions together, it was often he and I at the convention together and apart from, the rest of the professional guests. We sort of formed this oasis of our own.
So he was kind of a kindred spirit for you.
Yeah, absolutely. He was an outsider. He was, he was someone who stood in opposition to, all the prevailing get-along attitudes in the business. I mean, most of the cartoonists in his generation simply wanted to do what they were doing, and he was incredibly frustrated by what he had to do. He was frustrated, I think, throughout most of his career, at least from the 1950s until the end of his life. But he was locked into it. And I think part of his passion that's exhibited on these pages is a result of that frustration. He was always chafing at the editorial restrictions that he just loathed. I'll tell you a funny anecdote. I was talking. This was probably This was probably in the sometime in the early to mid '80s, and I was talking to Gil on the phone. No, you know what? I think it was in the 1990s, because I think I was in Seattle and Gil was still in L.A. And I was talking to Gil on the phone, and he was complaining about, whatever assignment he had for Marvel or DC at the time. He was just talking about how imbecile it was and how he, hated doing it. And he was working with some miserable writer, and it was just so stupid he couldn't believe it. And, of course, I was sympathetic to that. And I got off the phone with Gil, and 10 minutes later, I'm talking to Steve Ditko. And he was essentially working on, exactly the same kind of pap. Might have been Iron Man. And I asked him, well, how do you feel about doing that? Because I just gotten off the phone with Gil, who had been complaining for an hour about it. And Ditko told me, oh, it doesn't bother me at all. I just see it as an assignment, as a way to solve problems when I'm drawing, and it's no problem at all. And it was a complete contrast between one artist who was just bursting at the seams with frustration and indignation that he had to do this, and another artist who just accepted it with complete equanimity.
That reminds me of something that I was thinking about in reading these various interviews and panel discussions, is that something that comes up several times from Kane is when he is critiquing the state of the medium and his own participation in it and its limitations. Many times he comes back to the writing, mm-hmm. because he seems to have much kinder things to say for the art and where it has gone historically in terms of comics. But he argues again and again, it seems, that one of the things that's held the medium back is the subpar writing. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct, yeah. He thought the drawing was incredibly expressive. And, he even gave a certain latitude to, less than stellar drawing, because he thought it had it could have a kind of primitive, expressive quality to it. But he really hated the writing. He hated the formulaic, simplistic, one-dimensional writing that comics had trafficked in since the beginning, since the 1930s. And he himself, he was an autodidact. I think he was a high school dropout, if I remember correctly. And so everything he learned on his own. And when he started reading deeply and widely in the 1950s, I think he learned what good writing was. He gathered an appreciation for good writing, and then never looked back. And he was always comparing, the writing that he had to work on, the scripts that he was given, with what he knew to be good writing. And he thought that the writing was the big failure in comics. That's why he appreciated the EC books as much as he did, because, the writing was several notches above what was being done, under Al Feldstein and Harvey Kurtzman, and a handful of others over there. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it was the writing and the subject matter and the superficiality of it that he just couldn't stand.
Well, you being so close to him, what were your impressions of, let's say, his thoughts of the industry, the last decade of his life? I mean, obviously, beginning in the 80s and into the 90s, comics as a medium took a noticeable turn. Was this something that he was appreciative of, that he paid a lot of attention to?
Yes, he was. He died in 2000, so he was around to see, the increasing number of, serious cartoonists, people like Chris Ware and Charles Burns. When we were living at the same time in L.A., we were publishing Love and Rockets. And so he got to meet, he met the Hernandez brothers, and he knew the Hernandez brothers. He would see them at parties that we gave, and he would talk to them. And he loved their work. I think he appreciated, he loved the underground comics. He loved, the conversation with Robert Crumb, I think, is one of the best ones in there, because they're about as opposite as you can get for two artists. And yet I knew that Gil loved Crumb's work, and I knew that he respected Crumb's work. And I also knew that Crumb probably knew nothing about Gil's work, except that, the most superficial level. He'd probably seen it, but probably ignored it because he would have no interest in what Gil did. But I was counting on the fact that he would actually like Gil as a person and as a thinker. And as it turned out, that's exactly what happened. But Gil really appreciated the underground cartoonists, for their individuality and for what they did to liberate comics from all the things that he hated about comics. He very much wanted to express himself, and he knew he couldn't express himself the way the underground cartoonists could, completely unfettered by genre. I mean, the underground comics cartoonists, their sensibility was everything. Stylistically, they followed their own sensibility in what they did in terms of subject matter, in terms of their obsessions, their preoccupations. He couldn't do that, and he knew he couldn't do that, but he admired that. And I think he probably admired that far above what he thought he could do. I've already forgotten your question.
What he thought of comics during, let's say, the last decade of his life.
Oh yeah,
and
so he appreciated. I think he appreciated what was going on. That cartoonists were doing this, this work that was breaking out. Now, I think he also simultaneously had a problem appreciating it, to the extent that, he was also bound by his own, I'm not sure how to put this, intellectual limitations. He was marked. He often said that he was marked by pulp. He grew up as a kid reading comics and reading pulps, and he did that, until he was a young adult, and that left its mark on him. And even though he could appreciate, writers like Bellow or Nabokov, he still always gravitated himself to a pulpier kind of writing, richer than what was being done in comics, but not what you would call, literary fiction. Mm-hmm. And so I think he always, there was always a tension there between his appreciation for comics and his appreciation for the form and the most ambitious comics that were being done. Now, he thought, and I think quite rightly so, that all of Eisner's work that he did when Eisner was plumbing his literary mode from The Contract with God, 1977 on, I think he thought basically all of that was just bogus. It was all just sort of second-rate Isaac Bashevis Singer, and he saw through it. But he also, I think, had a little trouble appreciating artists working, that literary side of comics. He although he wanted comics to be elevated, he had some trouble seeing them as a purely literary form. And I think that had to do with his, the way he grew up reading comics and understanding comics, and as a working professional for so many years.
One of the things that struck me about that interview that you included between Gil Kane and Robert Crumb is the different directions that they were coming from. And they discussed this, especially in the first half of that interview, where Kane, as he describes it, is coming from a perspective that seems to privilege the more visually aesthetic, trying to appreciate or find more in his own work in the dramatic, whereas Crumb is coming from the more dramatic side of his art into more of an appreciation of the visual aesthetic side. And I'm just wondering, in terms of the drama, when I was reading that interview, I couldn't help but wonder, if Gil Kane were alive today, what he would think of the almost overwhelming proliferation of autobiographical comics, where the emphasis is almost entirely on the dramatic.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right. About that dynamic in the Crumb conversation. What I was so happy about during that is that they got along so well, even though they came from such antithetical points of view, and yet they somehow came together. In the middle. I think Gil would have been blown away by all the work, that's being done now. I know that he was just sort of stunned by how much interesting work was being done in the 90s. I would send him a lot of our books. He was living in Florida at that time. He moved to Florida somewhere around 94, something like that. And so we talked a lot on the phone. We would talk at least every week on the phone, but we didn't see each other as much. And but I know he was just blown away by the variety of work being done, by the level of work being done, by the subject matter that was being tackled, by books like from Joe Sacco, who was doing the his journalistic work. And I think it was just overwhelming for him, and that was back in the 90s when it was far less overwhelming than it is today. I think he would just be, kind of pleasantly stunned by the variety of work being done. And I think he would also acknowledge that, most of the work being done is still, second rate, but the best work is just something that he would never have envisioned happening when he was talking about this in the 60s and 70s. When he was talking about, comics having to elevate themselves in terms of subject, expression, and and expanding the expressive possibilities of the form. I don't think he really envisioned what eventually happened and what's happening today. But I think he would have been pretty thrilled by it.
Did he ever tell you that he felt that his works, His Name is Savage and Black Mark, were maybe a couple of decades too late?
No, he never expressed that sentiment to me. Those were the two best examples of him trying to put his theories into practice, and trying to break out of working for what was then the monolithic comic book industry. He and I would have numerous conversations about him doing projects like those, independent projects that he could claim as his own, that he could take some measure of control over, and that he could engineer completely himself. What he wanted to do was, he knew that he himself was not a great comics writer, and so he would always try to employ writers that he appreciated or admired or respected to write stories for him. And there were any number of writers that I know he spoke to and who actually wrote things for him, wrote treatments for graphic novels or comic series for him that he just never got around to drawing. And one of the problems that Gil had throughout his career was that he was always in need of money. He never earned a lot of money, and he needed money to just live a fairly modest middle-class lifestyle. And just to do that, in comics at that time, you had to continually produce work, and he never had the time to not produce work for Marvel or DC. He never had the time to spend 3 months or 6 months just doing his own projects. He could never get ahead enough to do that. Which it struck me as even more admirable that he spent so much time thinking about comics, and so much time reading and extrapolating from that reading and applying what he read to comics, but he never had the time to actually apply it to his own work. And there's a grim irony there.
Well, I want to ask you, as an editor, your logic in organizing the various pieces that make up Sparring with Gil Kane, because I noticed that the individual interviews and panel transcripts are not arranged in chronological order. And as I was going through everything, I was trying to figure out, okay, so how is Gary deciding what to put where, what piece before which one that follows? I don't know. What was your strategy in organizing them, if not chronologically?
Well, I was wondering about that myself after the book was printed and I was looking at it. I think I wanted to start off with, and there's part of it I'm not sure I can reconstruct, but I wanted to start off with Denny O'Neil because I thought that was the most contentious of the pieces. And that gave you a flavor of what Gil was advocating, and what he was advocating against, and what he was advocating for. And I thought that was the starkest conversation that laid out his contentiousness within the comics industry. The last two pieces I placed in those positions because Don Phelps, I thought, was the most indulgent piece. It was the most conversational piece. It was probably the least heavily edited piece. But I did that because I loved the interplay between the two of them so much. I didn't know how readers would really react to that, but I myself loved it. But it was also just the most undisciplined conversation. It took place over dinner at Gil's place one evening, and it was just kind of a free-for-all conversation. So I put that at the end. That was the penultimate piece, and then the last piece I wanted to include that round table with Stanley and Will Eisner, because I thought that would just make a good end piece. And now all the pieces in the middle, I did group together his conversations with the artists that were either his peers or who were older than he was, like Noel Sickles and Hal Foster, and I kind of grouped those together. And that was that. I mean, that's roughly, that was roughly, I think that was roughly my thinking. Mm. And I noticed that I put the Jean-Claude Messier interview right before Phelps because I thought, let's get the Americans out of the way. Put Jean-Claude right before Don Phelps. I don't know. It seemed right to me, that flow.
Hmm. Well, another question I have, editor to editor, is what went into the decision-making of which pieces to include and which ones we don't see in this collection?
Well, you see virtually every conversation I could find that he had with another cartoonist.
Okay.
So aside from the lost Eisner-Spielman conversation, they're all in here. I can't remember if there were any conversations that he was involved in that I found that I didn't think were good enough. I think this is everything I found. Okay.
Now, earlier at the top of our conversation, you had mentioned that Sparring with Gil Kane is one of 3 Kane-related projects that you have for Fantagraphics. You mentioned that another one is the pieces that Kane did, or the interviews that he did for the Comics Journal. That's going to be another book?
Yeah, that'll be another book. That'll include all the interviews that I did with Gil from the Comics Journal, as well as the alter ego interview from 1969 that John Benson did, that I talk about extensively in my introduction. And the version of that interview from alter ego will be the unabridged version of the interview, which no one has ever read.
Oh, okay.
He and John cut out a lot of things from that interview, mostly unflattering observations about Gil's peers, which I think Gil didn't want to include for obvious political reasons, which is to say, he had to live in that environment, and he could only live with a certain degree of antipathy being directed his way all the time. But now everyone's dead. So we're going to put all of those back because they were actually quite good. I mean, they were fascinating, albeit acerbic observations about a lot of his peers, and mostly about their shortcomings or their willingness to accept, the kind of work that they were doing.
And when might we expect that collection?
Well, probably 2020.
Okay.
Yeah, these things take a lot of time and a lot of work,
yeah.
as you probably know.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third book, you want to talk about the third book, right?
Sure, I'm curious.
Well, right before Gil died, he gave me 2 books that he kept over the course of about 20 years or so, and he called these his day books. And in them, he would jot his thoughts. These were thoughts about things that he was reading. These were prompted by things that he was reading. These were just observations that he would make about himself, about comics, about the form, about drawing, about his peers. And they're 2 fairly substantial volumes, all in his own handwriting. And I think they're absolutely fascinating. They're epigrammatic. They are, they're observational. They will be quotations from books that he was reading that he thought were particularly relevant to, what he was thinking at the time, or relevant to his own, intellectual education. And so I'm hoping to transcribe these from these 2 notebooks and to publish these as a book.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I think they're absolutely fascinating. A lot of observations about his peers, and of course these are pretty uncensored. I might have to go in and, I might not be able to include all of them because some of them are a little sensitive because he did not hold back because these were private journals. But he gave these to me, and I've spoken to his widow, Elaine, who I've also known since probably the late 70s, and she's given me permission to eventually publish these.
Well, let me pull back. I know that we can't go on forever, talking in this way, but I am curious, in a larger sense, about your work with Fantagraphics. Now, it's been almost 2 years since you had your 40th anniversary. Even a little longer than that since the death of Kim Thompson. And I'm curious, from your perspective as the publisher, where do you see Fantagraphics having gone over the past several years in terms of direction? Or maybe another way of asking or addressing this question is, where do you see it going now? Any particular changes? Anything we can look forward to? Anything noticeable?
Well, people always ask me that. People ask me, what are you going to do a few years from now that you're not doing now? And I always feel badly because I can't really articulate what we might be doing differently than we're doing now. I think we're actually publishing the best books we've ever published, and I think it's the best mix of books that we've ever published. Both in terms of the older work that we're getting back into print, our foreign, our translated books, and our contemporary graphic novels. By at least 2 generations of cartoonists now, maybe 3. So I think we're doing the best work we've been doing, and this is where we've been moving. This place is where we've been moving to for the last 20 years, or I guess maybe the last 40. We've always broken down our books among reprinted books. They're historical in nature. I mean, things like Walt Kelly's Pogo and Peanuts, and even books from Europe that are historical, or books from South America that are historical. I would point to our Guido Krapak's collection, for example. Mm-hmm. He was an incredibly innovative, formally innovative cartoonist from Italy, and we're publishing 10 volumes of his work. We just acquired the rights to publish all of Alberto Brescia's work, who is one of the great international masters. We're publishing numerous contemporary, both European and Asian cartoonists. Eric Reynolds, who is the associate publisher, is really has his fingers on the pulse of contemporary cartoonists. He's editing an anthology called Now, which features nothing but contemporary cartoonists. So I think we're as strong publishing contemporary cartoonists as we've ever been. I should say we're stronger than we've ever been, and and then we're continuing to plumb the history of comics and publishing the best material there. We're publishing Karl Barks and the EC books, and Don Rosa, and numerous other books from the history of American comics. So I don't know. I think we're in this incredibly exciting period. I think we're just doing the best work that we've ever done, and I just see that as continuing.
You mentioned the new anthology Now. I've told mm-hmm. Eric via email that was a title that I was very excited to hear about last year, because I've been waiting for you guys to do something in the vein of Mome, which I dearly loved. Mm-hmm. Was sorry when it went away. So I'm glad to see you have another such anthology. And in fact, we've reviewed the first 2 issues on the Comics Alternative, and we'll continue to do so with future ones. So that, also another thing I've noticed that over the past couple of years, you've started, I guess it's an imprint, and what is it? Fantagraphics Underground?
FU, yes.
Yeah. So I
love that title.
Yeah, and I've read many of the titles in that imprint, but I'm curious, you as a publisher, how would you define that imprint, and how might it be different from some of the other things that you would have normally published?
Well, it allows us the opportunity to publish books that we couldn't publish economically otherwise. And I created the imprint because I was looking at work that was not publishable, given our current economic model. And so I tried to create a new economic model that would allow us to do this. So, the work we're publishing, I think, is in the same aesthetic vein as the work we're publishing under Fantagraphics, but it's work that appeals to, if you can even imagine this, an even smaller, readership. I was looking at, and there are these oddball books that we want to publish that simply does not have, even by our modest standards, a mass readership. And by mass, I mean one of our books have to sell something like 3,000 copies to make them financially tenable. But there's a lot of work out there that's not going to sell 2,500 or 3,000 copies. It's going to sell 500 copies because that's the number of people who are sufficiently devoted to comics and sufficiently fanatical about comics as an art form who's going to support such a book. As a result, we can publish a book like John Hankiewicz's Education, or a magnificent book by Gerald Jablonski called Farmer Ned's Comics Barn that couldn't possibly exist if we had to print more than 500 or 600 copies of the book.
I have to say that Hankowicz's Education was one of my favorites from last year.
Oh, I'm really glad to hear that.
Yeah, in fact, we discussed it on our year-end show.
Oh, that's great. I didn't know that. Yeah, it's the kind of book that I think it's the kind of work that is essential, but that's not going to reach a wide readership because it's also difficult. And I hesitate to call it experimental, but I think it is to some extent. But it's the kind of book that is simply not going to be published otherwise.
And it definitely challenges the form and our understanding and definitions of comics. Yeah,
exactly. And that's why it's such an important book. It's like this can be done in comics. This is not being done in comics. To me, to me, a book like that is an inspiration, because you're trying to figure out, what is he doing here? How is he using the form, and why does it resonate as it does? Mm-hmm. It's the kind of book that I think other artists could look at and extrapolate form and use to grow themselves. And something like Jablonski's Farmer Ned's Comic Sparring is so fascinatingly unique. I'm not sure that is the kind of comic that an artist can extrapolate from and use, because it's so absolutely embodies his sensibility. Mm. And I've been following his work for many years. It also gives us the opportunity to publish, a collection of drawings by John Cuneo, whose perverse work I love, or a collection of graphic essays by Miriam Libicki called Toward a Hot Jew, about her Jewish and Israeli experience, which I thought was very important, but again, which is not going to reach a mass audience.
Right.
That's why I created the imprint, and it's taken, it probably took me a year or so to sort of get our footing. Originally, I thought we would be publishing more younger cartoonists who, the kind of cartoonists who display at MoCA and SPX, who weren't being published, but it's become much more of a mix of old and new, and oddball and otherwise unpublishable work.
And coming back to Gil Kane, the kind of things that basically takes many of his suppositions and challenges and draws them out to some kind of logical conclusion. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Gil was incredibly open. There was an innate curiosity there, and there was a cultivated intellect there. But he was much more open to the expressive breadth of comics than I think most of his peers were. Most of his peers were, that whole generation was a generation of immigrants. Most of them were not well educated, and what education they got themselves. And Gil was basically more ambitious intellectually and more curious than most of his peers. I think, therefore, more appreciative of things like the underground comics when they came on. I'm sure most of his peers probably couldn't care less about underground comics because they were too busy. They were too busy being craftsmen in their own very narrow field. But yeah, I would have loved to have sent Gil a copy of Farmer Ned's Comic Sparring and had a conversation about it. Yeah, it would have taken a big package.
Yeah.
Well, Gary, I want to thank you again for coming on the Comics Alternative and talking with me about your new book, Sparring with Gil Kane, Debating the History and Aesthetics of Comics. And I wish you the best of luck on it. Are you doing much publicity for this?
A little bit, yeah. You're my first interview.
Aww.
And I'm hoping to do a few more. And And I've gotten good response. So I think it'll reach an audience that will appreciate it.
It's well worth the read, and it struck me that something like this, with your particular book on Kane and the interviews as an example, this may be or could possibly be maybe a new future series for Fantagraphics, where you have collections of various interviews and transcripts of particular creators.
Well, you probably know we've done a number of collections of interviews,
right?
With Jack Kirby and Robert Crumb, and there's a book of interviews I did with Ralph Steadman, Jules Pfeiffer, Edward Sorrell, and David Levine, and a number of others. We have a 2-volume set of Zap interviews with the Zap creators. We have a 2-volume set of interviews with EC artists. So we like to do this. Mm-hmm. I would love to do collections of conversations between contemporary cartoonists.
Mm.
That would be, that'd be something I'd really love to do. Unfortunately, we're somewhat restricted economically because, as you probably know, books like that are not going to sell very well, and they're incredibly labor intensive,
right,
on every level. But that's the kind of thing that I think we do well, and that I want to keep doing. And I hope people do pick this up and appreciate it, and continue to support books like it.
Yes, they definitely should.
Well, I'm sure your podcast is going a long way toward fulfilling that goal too.
Well, I hope so. It's one of our hopes that listeners will definitely, if not go out and buy the book, at least check it out and see what it's about, because part of our mission is discussing comics that many people usually don't think about in terms of comics or books about comics.
Yeah, well, Gil would have been blown away that podcasts like yours even exist, because back then there was so little. There were so few ways. You just talk at conventions, or you talked in fanzines. But there was so little public, there was such a small public realm that allowed for such conversations back then.
Now there seems to be an overabundance at times.
Yeah, perhaps too much.
Yeah. Again, I want to thank Gary Groth for taking the time and coming on the Comics Alternative and talking about his new book, Sparring with Gil Kane, Debating the History and Aesthetics of Comics. And if you want to find great books like this, then definitely check out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. As I said at the top of the show, if you go to dcbservice.com right now, you'll find Sparring with Gil Kane at 35% off the cover price. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with me and let me know what you thought about my conversation with Gary. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can contact us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can email me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And you can find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, and we have channels on both Slack and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcast. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. We have more great podcast goodness lined up in the days to come, so be sure to check back for those episodes. Until then, take care.